inhibiting our ability to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom. That's what we need the government to address and resolve.
Yeah, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question and his point, and he's made this to me in no uncertain terms on a number of occasions, and I thank him for his frankness in those discussions as well, because without the identifying exactly what the issues are, you can skate around them for ages and not get anywhere. As he well knows, that there are things I think we can do as a government that can exemplify and amplify how we can solve the problem that is behind his question. And I look forward to having further engagement with him on those matters.
Sir Jeffrey.
Mr. Speaker, I too look forward to that engagement, because if we are to get Stormont restored on a stable foundation, which is what we want, then we've got to resolve these issues. And people in Northern Ireland, unionists in particular, need to know that their place in the United Kingdom, which was enshrined and protected in Article 1 of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, will be equally enshrined and protected in UK law as a result of any arrangements that are put in place.
Yeah, and I want to be able to, and I can give him that assurance from this dispatch box, but I know, because of the engagement that we've had, that he'd like to see that in other terms as well. And that is why I look forward to our continuing conversations, so we can work out exactly what the ask is, so I can try and deliver on that.
Mary Glendon.
Question 2, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Northern Ireland Department of Education has been allocated £2.6 billion of resource, representing a 1.8% reduction from 22-23. Education is a devolved matter, and in the absence of an executive or assembly, the assessments of any potential impacts of these decisions are matters for the Northern Ireland Department of Education.
Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Children's Law Society has warned that cuts in Northern Ireland's budget could be in breach of the commitments made to children in the Good Friday Agreement, with services for disadvantaged children the primary target. How will the Secretary of State ensure that budget cuts will not cause active harm to the most vulnerable children in Northern Ireland schools?
Mr. Speaker, we share her concern, and that's why my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, met with them last week. But what I would just say to her, as gently as I can, is according to Ulster University, they tell us that the current structural division in Northern Ireland's education system is inefficient, and that maintaining it comes at a cost of £226 million a year. That's about £600,000 every day. I think we all have to ask ourselves very serious questions about how this money can best be spent. I think she gives us some illustrations.
Robin Walker.
My honourable friend rightly points to the benefits of integration in Northern Ireland's education system, but he must recognise it is a matter of great concern that as this government seeks to increase education spending in real terms, it is declining in absolute terms in Northern Ireland over the coming years. Isn't this a reason to get an executive in place as soon as possible so they can address some of the long-term issues of reform that education and businesses are calling out for?
Mr. Speaker, I agree fully with my honourable friend. But he's absolutely right. It is necessary to get on with structural reform, and it is a matter of concern that we're in the position where we are. But across a broad range of public services, it is necessary to have reform to make the public finances sustainable.
Shadow Minister Tony Antoniadze.
Mr. Speaker, on his visit to Belfast last month, the Prime Minister expressed the view that integrated education should be the norm, not the exception. But the current strategy for growing integrated education has no targets for student numbers and doesn't specify how much money will be spent. Can the Minister outline how this government will ensure that integrated education does become the norm?
Well, of course, as she knows, this policy is a matter for a restored executive, and the first thing we need to do is encourage all parties to get back into the executive and bring forward that strategy. But I certainly am grateful for this indication that she and I will be united in pressing forward and saying that we should have integrated education as the norm. I have heard people's concerns from the other side of the argument, and of course I'm in favour of faith schools and freedom of religion. But we really do need to make sure that never again does a minister go to Northern Ireland and hear a young person say that they were 16 or 18 before they met their first unionist or their first Catholic. That's something which I've experienced. I'm not at all happy about it.
Got a beard. Alex Davis-Jones.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll answer questions 3, 10 and 13 together. The UK Government is committed to supporting Northern Ireland through the recent increase in the cost of living. That's why we're taking steps including lowering the cost of energy, targeting support for the most vulnerable through a £900 cost of living payment in 23-24 for households on means-tested benefits, delivering £600 energy payments to businesses and households, the £300 cost of living payment for pensioners, and an additional £150 disability cost of living payment for individuals entitled to disability benefits.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Speaker, last week the Permanent Secretary to the Department of Finance in Northern Ireland told its Select Committee that we are rapidly, if not already, at the point at which funding per head is not at the level of measured need. The truth is the Barnett consequential funding model has not kept up with the cost of living crisis. So what exactly does the Minister have to say to the people who are having to make their money stretch further and further whilst their bills continue to skyrocket?
Well, what I would say to them is that this government, my right honourable friend and I, and Lord Kane, are all absolutely seized of the imperative to put the finances on a sustainable basis and to have public sector reform to ensure that the money is well spent. There are a number of opportunities in health and education that have been not only articulated today but identified in public in the past. We do need to look at revenue raising, which I hope she'll return to later when we get to the bill. But absolutely, we need to say to people it's time to put Northern Ireland's finances on a sustainable basis, to have reforms so they get the public services they deserve, and of course the route to that is a restored executive.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker. This government is creating more red tape for businesses with new labelling requirements that will be needed for food products across the UK after the Windsor Framework. Will they look again at a veterinary agreement with the EU which would eliminate these costs?
Well done. Mr. Speaker, forgive me, I only partially heard the honourable gentleman's question, but we will of course continue to talk to the European Union about these matters. We want the smoothest flow of trade, not only with the European Union but with all of our international trading partners, and certainly we'll consider things. But what I have to say to him is we are determined that we have left the European Union. What we won't be doing is following their rules as handed down.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor has failed to bring in a proper windfall tax while oil and gas giants are raking in record profits. Does the Minister agree that there are still huge holes in the government's levy that will mean that households in Northern Ireland will lose out on billions of pounds that could be used with the cost of living burden?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I noted that he said a proper windfall tax. That does indicate that it is, of course, a contested matter about what a windfall tax should be. But I think that, really, if I may say so, his question's rather out of scope for the Northern Ireland office. Many of these matters are devolved, others are reserved to the Treasury.
Simon Horcher of the Select Committee.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend will know that there are many groups in Northern Ireland who are providing advice to people to help with the cost of living and other challenges. Many of those organisations are in receipt of funding from the Shared Prosperity Fund. Could I urge him, notwithstanding that, to talk to ministers in the relevant department to ensure that there is a bespoke definition and the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland are taken into account when making funding determinations under the Shared Prosperity Fund?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I wonder if I could encourage him to meet with me to discuss exactly what should be in that definition. I'd be grateful if he would.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I, just as in Newcastle under Lyme, could I welcome the government's support for households and businesses in Northern Ireland with energy costs? However, isn't it the case that in Northern Ireland some of these schemes could have been more efficiently delivered if there was a functioning executive?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, 100%. That's absolutely right. And I experienced myself, as did the Secretary of State, the difficulties which followed. But I have to say that I'm very grateful to the officials and ministers of Bays for making possible the delivery of the schemes. But he's 100% correct.
Robin Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has demonstrated a swiftness of foot in responding through the pandemic and through the energy crisis to support businesses and residents. The previous question notwithstanding, can my honourable friend reassure the House that residents and businesses in Northern Ireland will continue to receive support from this government for energy bills over the coming months?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we will, of course, continue to be absolutely seized of the situation in Northern Ireland, and I'll tell him that we'll keep this situation under review.
Theresa Villiers.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker, sir.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the Government is engaging extensively with businesses to explain what has been agreed under the framework, and we will be providing detailed guidance over the summer on how the Green Lane will operate.
The framework alleviates some really significant problems, but it doesn't remove all frictions on trade, it doesn't restore Northern Ireland's control over its own laws, and it hasn't restored power sharing. So when will the Government be reviewing that framework, and will this be part of the TCA review that's going to be taking place over the next 2 years?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I recognise that keeping in place that 3% of EU law necessary to have an infrastructure-free border is an extremely difficult compromise, not only for unionism but also for Eurosceptics like her and like me. We do need to implement the framework that we've agreed, and of course we'll keep this too under constant review. I'm grateful that my right honourable friend, raises the TCA review. I think one of the great benefits of the Windsor framework, which has been largely unexplored, is that now that we have a much more positive relationship both with Ireland and with our European Union partners, I think it's possible that we could achieve great things in that TCA review, and I'd be very grateful to her for collaboration towards that end.
Paul Gurby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Minister of State, the oversell of the Windsor framework indicated to businesses that the Green Lane would operate with no restrictions whatsoever. That is untrue. There still will be required customs declarations. When can we have the freedom to trade within our own United Kingdom without additional paperwork required?
Mr Speaker, it is not the case that there will be customs declarations on the Green Channel. That is not the case. What will be shared is ordinary commercial data. There will be no more data required to go to Northern Ireland on the Green Lane than there would be to ship within Great Britain across to, say, the Isle of Wight.
We come to SNP spokesperson Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In a statement last month, the British Potato Trade Association described the Windsor framework as representing a step closer to achieving the ultimate aim of reopening seed potato trade with the European Union. So can I ask the Secretary of State what further guidance will be issued to exporters? What's being done to allow domestic Northern Irish consumers to access high-quality seed potato exports from Scotland? And what will his team be doing to try and replicate this hard-won market access in Northern Ireland right across the far more lucrative EU market?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'll be absolutely delighted if Scottish seed potatoes are sent to all of Europe. I see there's no practical reason why they shouldn't be. My right honourable friend mentioned the TCA review. I would love to be able to deliver seed potatoes to all of Europe way before then, and I very much hope that the honourable gentleman will support us as we seek to do so.
Luke Jones.
Question 5, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
A busy day again, Mr Speaker. Social security and state pensions are transferred matters in Northern Ireland, and so the responsibility of the Northern Ireland Executive. We have taken decisive action to help UK households tackle increases in the cost of living. Women across Northern Ireland are benefiting from energy bill support and support for the most vulnerable, including an additional £900 cost of living payment in 23-24 for households on means-tested benefits.
Luke Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. WASPI women in Northern Ireland, like those in Newport West and the rest of the UK, want to see fairness and equality once and for all. So can the Minister tell us what specific discussions he's had about the rising cost of living and its impact on WASPI women in Northern Ireland with the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the political parties in Northern Ireland?
As I said, Mr Speaker, this is a transferred matter. This is a transferred matter under the devolution settlement, but what I would say to the Honourable Lady is that we all know that this has been a very sensitive matter throughout certainly my time in Parliament, and I've met many of my constituents concerned about this issue. But I'd say to anybody on the benches opposite, if they think this issue of pensions is going away in our lifetimes, I would encourage them to look at the OBR Fiscal Sustainability Report and other reports from the Government Actuaries Department.
Norris.
Question 6, Mr Speaker.
The Government I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. The Government recognises the importance of support services for women, and I will continue to engage with women's groups and organisations supporting women and girls across Northern Ireland as I have done. It's vital for the Executive to be restored as soon as possible to deliver on these issues that matter most to the people of Northern Ireland, including the vital support for services like those my honourable friend has championed through her APPG.
Liz.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State, I know, understands the issues facing menopausal women. With no legislation currently in Stormont, there are no plans for a women's health strategy, nor any proactive work taking place to address these issues. So will he agree to meet with representatives of the Menopause Support Group Northern Ireland to share their concerns and support their campaign for improved menopause services?
As the House has demonstrated, that is a very popular question, so I can do nothing else other than say yes, I'll happily meet with the Honourable Lady.
Bob Blackman.
Question number 8, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, the Government legislated under the 2020 UK Internal Market Act to provide for unfettered access to the UK internal market for Northern Ireland goods. The Windsor Framework further guarantees unfettered access for Northern Ireland's businesses to the UK market on a permanent basis.
Bob Blackman.
I thank my honourable friend for that answer. Does he agree with me that the Windsor Framework potentially gives the Northern Ireland people the opportunity to trade with the Republic as well as the rest of the United Kingdom?
I do agree, Mr Speaker. The Windsor Framework represents an extraordinary opportunity for Northern Ireland for the long term. Not only will Northern Ireland have privileged access to the EU market and to the UK market, but Northern Ireland will also be under UK services regulation and will have access to our free trade agreements like our accession to CPTPP. That is an extraordinary opportunity. We should make the most of it.
Sammy Wilson.
The GP border operating model, which has been recently published by DEFRA, indicates that by October this year there will be border checkpoints at Cairnryan, Liverpool and Holyhead. How is the Minister able to claim that there will be frictionless trade between Northern Ireland and GB when the Government is actually proposing to put border control posts on our trade routes into our most important market?
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend and I share many views in common, but I have to say to him as gently as possible, I think he's really referring to the red lane there. And I have to tell him, I think if we'd moved forward with the protocol bill, I would just say to him that would have implemented a red and a green lane, and the red lane would have required checkpoints. We have to engage seriously with the legitimate interests of Ireland and the European Union, and that means a solution of the form we've taken with the Windsor Framework. I'm proud that the Prime Minister did a deal that people said couldn't be done and got progress from both sides.
We now come to questions. Prime Minister Clive Lewis.
Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 2 years ago, I raised the case of a Norwich Army veteran. In such agony, he was forced to pull out 18 of his own teeth because he couldn't get access to a dentist. The grim fact is, despite repeated promises from the Prime Minister, Norwich and Norfolk remain dental deserts. So, Mr Speaker, dentists excel at extracting rotten teeth. So will the Prime Minister agree with me? The only way my constituents will see results is when this rotten government is extracted from office and replaced with a Labour one.
Mr Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the honourable gentleman's constituent. With regard to dentistry, he'll know there are record sums going into dentistry and indeed 500 more NHS dentists working today. Because of the contract reforms that we've put in place, 10% more activity can happen, and DHSE are currently talking about reforming the dentistry contract with the persons in practice to increase activity further.
Jacob Mahindra.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent Gordon, unfortunately, has been receiving cancer treatment at the Mount Vernon Hospital, which will soon fall within Sadiq Khan's new ULEZ boundaries. As Gordon continues his daily treatment, he will now be expected to pay £12.50 a charge or buy a new compliant vehicle. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the British people already have enough on without Labour's London Mayor stretching household budgets further, just so he can cover his mismanagement of TfL finances?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm sorry to hear of my honourable friend's constituent Gordon, and I send him my best wishes. He will know that transport in London is devolved to the Labour Mayor, who is expanding the zone against the overwhelming views of residents and businesses. And what's more, his plan to raise costs for hard-working families is totally backed by the Leader of the Opposition. Perhaps he can now tell us why.
I don't think he's responsible for the questions. We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank all those who took part in the coronation celebrations over the weekend? And can I also take this chance to wish all the very best to my brilliant and talented constituent, May Muller, who is representing the UK at Eurovision in Liverpool this weekend. The whole country is behind you, May. Now, Mr. Speaker, this time last week, the Prime Minister had to correct the record on misleading claims he made about employment numbers. Can he provide a further update? Now he's cost 1,000 Tory councillors their jobs.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me pass on my best wishes to May as well for this weekend Eurovision. With regard to the local elections, Mr. Speaker, maybe I can just offer the honourable gentleman a tiny bit of advice from one of his predecessors. One of his predecessors, Tony Blair, who I was reading the other day. What did Tony Blair? He said the right honourable gentleman can be as cocky as he likes about the local elections. Come a general election, policy counts. And we know, Mr. Speaker, the problem for him is he doesn't have any.
The Prime Minister said he was going to lose 1,000 seats, and then he managed it. After 13 years, a Tory promise they actually haven't broken. And this is the Prime Minister who's only had to fight for two things in his life. Last year, he lost a Tory beauty contest to the member for South West Norfolk, who then lost to a lettuce. Last week, when he finally came into contact with voters, he lost everywhere. No matter who the electorate is, the Prime Minister keeps entering a two-horse race and somehow finishing third. Given his track record, who does he think he's actually got a mandate from?
Mr. Speaker, it's a bit rich to hear about mandates from the person who's broken every single promise he was elected on. I mean, go through the list, Mr. Speaker. Nationalisations, NHS outsourcing, universal credit, and now tuition fees. Mr. Speaker, he was for them all before he was against them. He's not just the softy, he's the flaky too.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can understand why the Prime Minister is trying to wish away his terrible results, but peddling nonsense just doesn't work. Up and down the country, people want the government to focus on the cost of living, but he's got no answers. Is he planning to carry on as if nothing happened and ignore the message he was sent last week? Or is he going to do what a Labour government would do and announce an immediate freeze in council tax bills?
Mr. Speaker, I know he's asked his Labour councillors rightly to focus on the cost of living. Perhaps they could start with reducing council tax to the level in Conservative-run areas. But, Mr. Speaker, we're getting on with halving people's energy bills, freezing fuel duty to help them with the cost of living. What is stopping him having a plan is that, unfortunately, his Shadow Chancellor recently said she's discovered she's got a problem, Mr. Speaker. She realised that she actually, this is what she said, she actually has to, shock horror, say where the money's going to come from. With a £90 billion black hole in her plans, she's got a lot of work to do.
Mr. Speaker, there's only one party that broke the economy, and they're sitting right there. And it seems to me, to quote one of his more electorally successful predecessors, nothing has changed. Still blaming other people, still refusing to take the necessary action, still not listening to the country. And on council tax, it's quite simple. A Labour government would give every council the grant they need to freeze those bills, fully paid for by ending the handouts he's giving to oil and gas giants. So I ask him again, now his plan has been utterly rejected, why won't he do the same?
Prime
Mr. Speaker, just a quick history lesson. While he was busy softening sentences 13 years ago, let me just remind him what we inherited. It was the largest deficit in the G7 from Labour. Higher unemployment. The coffers were totally empty. And it didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. After that, they wanted a longer lockdown. And now, they won't even oppose the picketers and the protesters, Mr. Speaker. Even in opposition, they're damaging the economy.
He's just not listening, is he? Even after the entire country, Mr. Speaker, from the Peak District to the Garden of England, rejected his government last week, he still thinks that protecting oil and gas profits is more important than freezing bills. Now, I'm sure the Prime Minister must finally have met some working people in recent weeks. Did any of them understand why he insists on protecting his precious non-dom tax status rather than scrapping it and using the money to train thousands of doctors and nurses?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he said that this money would fund the NHS workforce, but that plan was actually looked at by one of his own colleagues recently. Now that person said that it would discourage doctors and nurses from coming here. And that there was a £2 billion shortfall in his sums. Who said that? It was Alistair Darling. He might remember those days. It's when Labour bankrupted the economy.
I think that is the definition of nonsense. And this is the price of having a tired, worn-out government fronted by a Prime Minister who boasts he's never had a working-class friend. He's smiling his way through the cost-of-living crisis, gloating about success while waiting lists grow. He's pretending that crime, house building, schools are all just doing fine, while handing the country 24 tax rises, all with his name on them. How does he think the Tories can possibly provide the answers Britain needs when the whole country has already told him they're the problem, not the solution?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right. We all do say some silly things when we're younger. I was a teenager, and he'll know what I'm talking about, because I think in his 40s he was still talking about abolishing the monarchy, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
But it's the same old guff from him every week, Mr. Speaker. All politics and no action. We're getting on with halving people's energy bills, freezing fuel duty, cutting the costs of childcare, and boosting pay. While he's busy plotting coalitions, we're getting on and delivering for the British people.
Mr. Speaker, this Saturday is Surrey Day, a chance for locals and visitors to celebrate everything wonderful about our county, including our beautiful historic High Street in Guildford with its independent shops. But frequently raised with me is empty shops. High rents with high business rates makes it difficult for independent retailers to compete with national chains. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this government must do everything it can to support our high streets as part of our plan to boost economic growth?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of high streets for local communities, not just in Surrey but around the country. That's why we are abolishing business rates for hundreds of thousands of eligible businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure sector, and investing billions of pounds through the High Streets Fund and our Towns Fund to support local communities up and down the country.
SNP spokesperson Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister was to go to the boot of his Land Rover and pull out some placards which said "Save our nom-doms," would he expect to be arrested by the police?
Mr. Speaker, can I first put on record my thanks to the police for all their hard work over the weekend, ensuring that the coronation was a success. Now, look, on this issue, Mr. Speaker, we believe the police should have powers to make sure that they can protect the public from unnecessary and serious disruption. I respectfully recognise that the honourable gentleman disagrees with our position. I guess the question for both of us is, what does the honourable leader of the opposition think about this? Because it's quite hard to keep up.
Can I just remind the Prime Minister? It's Prime Minister's questions for him to answer, not asking, not for what the opposition's doing. Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about here is that nurses strike, doctors strike, firefighters strike, protest, firefighters protest, and of course Republicans protest as well. And they do so because it's a fundamental right within our democracy to be able to protest. So is the Prime Minister seriously saying that moving forward you can have your rights, but only on his terms?
Mr. Speaker, it is also the right of the British public to be able to go about their ordinary day-to-day lives without undue serious disruption. That's why it's right that the police have extra powers. I respect that the honourable gentleman disagrees with that, but we think it is right, and people will see every day on TV, their lives being disrupted. They're not able to get to school, to get to hospital appointments, and indeed to get to work. They should be able to do that, and the police should have powers to stop those who are preventing that from happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was an honour to welcome the Australian Prime Minister to Barrow last week so he could meet some of our fantastic apprentices, see the submarine programme and reaffirm his commitment to the AUKUS programme that will deliver thousands of jobs in my constituency and keep our nation safe. But what was a national endeavour is now an international one, and it's going to require a whole-of-government approach to get it over the line and deliver it well. So with that in mind, could I invite my right honourable friend to Barrow to see the programme for himself, and also to meet with me to see how we can best leverage the opportunities from this for the people of Barrow for generations to come?
Well, my honourable friend is a fantastic advocate for his local industry and community, and he's right, the SSN AUKUS submarines will be built in Barrow, the home of the British submarine industry. It will create thousands of new jobs, not just in Barrow, but across the UK. That's why the government is investing billions to modernise the enterprise, and I look forward to taking him up on his invitation.
And David.
Mr. Speaker, last week many lifelong Conservative voters turned to the Liberal Democrats to be their strong local champions. They delivered their verdict on the government's failure to hold water companies to account for dumping raw sewage into our rivers and onto our beaches. Last year, water bosses were paid £15 million in bonuses, rewarded for destroying our precious natural environment. 3 of those executives have now turned down their bonuses, but they should never have been entitled to them in the first place. So will the Prime Minister ban these sewage bonuses so that the dumping actually stops?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I struggle to hear the full question, but I think in one sense it doesn't really matter, because we all know the Liberal Democrats say one thing here and another thing locally anyway. And it is remarkable. No wonder he's attracted to the Labour leader these days, Mr. Speaker. Political opportunism and a broken promise on tuition fees. It must be like looking in the mirror.
Ben Bradley.
To highlight some success, with Mansfield District Council now having more Conservative councillors than at any point in my lifetime after last week's local elections. I'm very proud of our local team. But one thing we heard on the doorstep was frustration. Frustration and expectation that government needs to deliver on key pledges. There has been a commitment to our part of the world that we'll be given the clout, the investment to catch up with other regions that historically have had more than we've had. So will the Prime Minister take the opportunity to reiterate his commitment and to my constituents reassure them that he will support growth and investment in the East Midlands?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a tireless advocate for the East Midlands, and in particular, I welcome the devolution deal that has been agreed among the 4 local authorities in the region, something I know my honourable friend has campaigned for, and like him, I look forward to those new devolved institutions being established as soon as possible to drive economic growth in his community.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has previously declared, and I quote, "My daughter is the climate change champion in our house." I wonder if he's asked her what she thinks about Rosebank, the biggest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea, which would blow climate targets, create more emissions than 28 of the world's poorest countries combined, involve the obscene transfer of £4 billion of taxpayers' money to a Norwegian energy firm, Equinor, and do nothing for energy security since the vast majority of the oil will be exported. If he gives it the green light, will he be able to look his daughter in the eye and honestly say that he has done everything in his power to give her and all other young people a livable future?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, as the Independent Committee for Climate Change has acknowledged, we will need fossil fuels for the next few decades as we transition to a greener future. And during that period, it makes absolutely no sense to not invest in the resources we have here at home, to import foreign fossil fuels, not create jobs here, and import them at twice the carbon emissions as our local resources. It is an economically illiterate policy, Mr. Speaker, but that's what you'd expect from the Green Party.
George Eustace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last June, the government committed to bring forward a horticulture strategy to identify ways to expand British production of horticulture. And the importance of this was underlined by some of the supply chain challenges we saw earlier this spring. But in the last week, there's been speculation that the government might be abandoning that strategy. Can the Prime Minister give us any reassurance that the government remains committed to expanding this important British industry?
Prime Minister. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for all of his work championing this area. We are delivering for the horticulture sector, and it will benefit from the £168 million investment to drive innovation and support fruit production. And that's why we also passed the new Genetic Technology Act, Mr. Speaker, taking advantage of our Brexit opportunities to unlock the potential of new technologies. But I look forward to discussing this and other ideas at our new upcoming Food Summit.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Prime Minister or any of his ministers given commitments to BP, Equinor or any other company about contracts at the Teesworks site?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, contracts at the site would be a commercial matter for the companies involved.
Mr. Speaker, our farmers provide our food and our countryside's future. But there's concern among some Oxfordshire farmers that the new schemes under DEFRA's Agricultural Transition Plan aren't ready for farmers to access them to make up the shortfall from the basic payment scheme. Will my right honourable friend push his colleagues in DEFRA to roll out the rest of the SFI standards as soon as possible and to consider double stacking SFI and countryside stewardship payments to ensure that Oxfordshire's farmers get the support they need?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and of course we want to make sure that we continue to support farmers to produce healthy, nutritious food. We are pressing ahead with the ELM scheme, fine-tuning them though to make sure that they work even better for farmers. We want to make sure there's enough flexibility in the sustainable farming initiatives, and that's why DEFRA have designed the schemes with farmers in mind, enabling them to do more and to make sure that they can use countryside stewardship schemes on the same plots of land. But I look forward to discussing this with him and other colleagues as well.
Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Stirling, we've got a really potentially very exciting development at Forthside on former Ministry of Defence land, and sadly the development's got a bit stuck over a dispute about the costs of the decontamination of that land. Now, I'll work with anybody to get a result for Stirling. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and representatives of Stirling Council to get this development unblocked and make the progress we all want to see?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have invested in Stirling previously to unlock investment and drive growth, and I'll ensure that the honourable gentleman gets the meeting he needs with the relevant minister to make progress.
Mark Warburton.
The Prime Minister and I share a profound optimism about the power of technology, and AI in particular has the power to revolutionise public services and our private sector as well. But does he agree with me that it comes with risks? And while there are unrealistic calls to pause research into it altogether, it is crucial for us to work with our allies around the world so that the global norms that emerge in this important area reflect our values.
Well, my honourable friend speaks with experience and knowledge on this issue, and I absolutely agree with the thrust of his question. Whilst it would be implausible and wrong to halt the development of this technology, it is right that we ensure that there are appropriate guardrails in place as we look to exploit its opportunities. Those are the conversations we are having, not just with the companies involved, but also with our allies around the world, and he can expect further progress in the coming weeks and months.
Mike Nolly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from his earlier answer, as the Prime Minister knows, an Eat Out to Help Out scheme was introduced in August 2020. which increased demand for eating in restaurants by some 216% compared to 2019, with figures now showing that over 17,500 retail chain stores closed in 2020 alone, affecting nearly 35,000 employees. Would or has the Prime Minister considered a similar scheme for bricks and mortar retail, bricks versus clicks if you like, as part of the wider plan for regenerating local high streets and town centres?
Well,
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the way that we are supporting high streets and town centres is through making sure that we cut business rates in England. Obviously, the Scottish Government will receive Barnett consequentials from those actions, but now hundreds of thousands of local businesses on our high streets don't pay any business rates at all. And on top of that, through the Levelling Up Fund, Towns Fund and others, we're investing directly in local communities. Indeed, in his own, where I know council leaders described our investment of £19 million as very welcome and a real boost for the economic recovery.
Maggie through.
Mr. Speaker, my regional friend recently scored a very rare own goal by backing Stockton Football Club in the Northern Premier League East Playoff Final, which eventually saw Long Eaton United win on penalties. In the interest of good sportsmanship, will he now congratulate Ian Deakin and his team on their resounding victory, wish Long Eaton United every success in the league for next season, and join me at Grange Park to cheer on Long Eaton United for the next season and wish them luck every season in the future?
Yeah, well, Mr. Speaker, can I join my honourable friend in congratulating her local football team and all involved in their stunning success. I'm not sure if I'll be able to join her in the immediate future, but I do look forward to seeing them go from strength to strength, much as the fortunes of my own team, sadly, are not in the place I would like them to be.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister may well have seen the astonishing sight of a former Scottish Government Minister standing up in the Chamber of Scottish Parliament and tearing up, literally ripping into pieces, the Scottish Government's highly protected marine area proposal. This proposal is deeply controversial all over Scotland and has even led to it being compared with the second Highland clearances. Is this not now the time? Is this not now the time for the UK Government to step in and work with the devolved...
There you have it.
Mr. Speaker, I will not be silenced, because it matters... This matters deeply to my constituents. Deeply. Is it not time for the UK Government to step in, work with the devolved administrations to come up with a scheme that works and is acceptable, a conservation scheme that is acceptable in our fishing communities all around the UK?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an excellent point, and he is a passionate champion, as he should be, for his local fishing communities. And he's right to highlight the concerns that have been raised, not just by them, but by members of the SNP's own party, about the potentially damaging impact of their plans to introduce the highly protected marine areas in the way that they are. I would encourage the SNP government to continue working with the Scottish fishing industry and coastal communities to understand their concerns, and as we've seen them recently U-turn on other poor thought-out decisions, hopefully they can relook at this one too.
Manchester.
The United Kingdom has a strong, deep, multi-dimensional relationship with Pakistan. And there are over 1.5 million British Pakistanis here, and many of them are dual nationals, as am I. The Prime Minister will have seen the scenes coming out from Pakistan, the civil unrest where people have lost their lives due to the detention of the Prime Minister Imran Khan. There are real concerns about the circumstances of his detention and the right to have a fair trial. The United Kingdom has in the past sent observers to hearings around the world to ensure natural justice is done. Has the Prime Minister considered that? If not, will he consider it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. The UK, of course, has a long-standing and close relationship with Pakistan, and this weekend, especially as Commonwealth partners. The arrest of the former Prime Minister is an internal matter for Pakistan. We support peaceful, democratic processes and adherence to the rule of law, and we are monitoring the situation carefully.
Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A little boy has gone to school today in shoes that don't fit him because his parents can't afford new ones. A little girl had water on her cornflakes because her mum had no money for milk. These are real stories from Faith and Families, a charity in my constituency that deal with poverty every day. Poverty that is causing prolonged shame and leading to a mental health crisis. Faith and families are worried about these kids. I'm worried about these kids. If the Prime Minister is worried about these kids, what's he going to do about it?
Mr. Speaker, we don't want any child to grow up in poverty, and that's why I'm proud that there are 1.7 million fewer people living in poverty today than in 2010 because of the actions of this and previous Conservative governments. That includes hundreds of thousands of children. And we are providing incredible support to the most vulnerable in our society as we speak. Just last week, the first of our cost of living payments went out, £900 to help the most vulnerable families in our society. Those are our values, and we will keep supporting them as the inflation remains high.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier in questions, the Leader of the Opposition sought to draw attention to council tax rates and council tax increases and offering some crocodile tears in the process. Can I draw attention to the Prime Minister's attention that whereas we have seen 43% increase in council tax rates since 2010 in England, the increase in Wales has been a staggering 67%. So therefore, is it not the case we should be looking at what Labour do rather than what Labour say?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point. The Leader of the Opposition is very fond in telling us that Labour in Wales is his blueprint for how he would like to run the country, and as we've seen, all it means is higher bills for hard-working British families.
Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 2 years, the Drax Power Station in Yorkshire has, on average, burned almost 20,000 tonnes of trees every single day, releasing an equivalent amount of carbon into the atmosphere. During that time, whilst our constituents have struggled with their heating bills, the private company running Drax has received £1.5 million of subsidy through the government's energy policy every single day. This is set to continue until 2027. Can I ask the Prime Minister, will he step in and review this grotesque distortion of energy policy, which incentivises deforestation whilst making no contribution to tackling the climate emergency?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, while not being able to comment on the contract details of one particular company, what I can say is that our record on this issue is that since the benchmark was established, emissions in this country have fallen by almost 50%, whilst at the same time we've grown the economy by 2/3, not something I know the SNP government is as focused on as we are, but at the same time, because of the way that we regulate new and renewable energies, we've seen the price of renewables like offshore wind decline from £140 an hour to around 40. That shows a regulatory system that is working in delivering lower cost renewable energy for British families.
Mr. Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Plastic pollution is a scourge of modern-day society. My 10-minute rule bill seeks to have microfibre, microplastic filters fitted in all commercial and domestic washing machines, legislation which France and other countries have already moved forward with. Will the Prime Minister, who has already done an enormous amount in tackling plastic pollution, will he organise a meeting between me and the stakeholders, particularly washing machine manufacturers, with the Secretary of State to discuss this very important issue?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we want to tackle microplastic pollution wherever possible, which is why we introduced a microbead ban and a tax on plastic bags. I know my honourable friend has campaigned for filters on washing machines, but he will also know they can be costly to install. DEFRA have outlined plans to make sure that we can use more filters, but I will ensure that he gets the meeting that he needs with the relevant minister to discuss this important matter further.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government ditching its pledge to recruit 6,000 more GPs is yet another example of the Tories over-promising and under-delivering, with teacher recruitment targets missed and housing pledges shelved. Why does the Prime Minister think that the only target he's actually met was the loss of 1,000 Tory councillors last week?
Maybe the Honourable Gentleman can tell us which of the many promises that the Leader of the Opposition made to him when he was campaigning he's most happy that he's U-turned on.
Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Lincolnshire's roads, foodstuffs grown in our fine county are transported across the nation. But the Highways Authority struggles to fund roads because of the skewed funding formula devised by a previous Labour government. So many of our public services suffer, policing included. So will the Prime Minister agree to urgently review the local government funding formula, the police funding formula, so that Lincolnshire can have a fair deal?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to stand up for the particular needs of his rural community, and like him I recognise that rural areas do often have higher costs of providing services. It's right that those are reflected where we can in funding formulas, but I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with a relevant minister to discuss this important matter further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 13,450 prepayment meter vouchers have gone unclaimed in my Glasgow Central constituency at a value of over £887,000. Across Scotland, £16.5 million is unclaimed. The Prime Minister's Energy Bill Support Scheme is failing if money which could be helping our vulnerable constituents is resting in his government's account. I recall he's not very familiar with how prepayment meters work, but what will he do to ensure that every single penny gets out of government coffers and into the meters of those who really need it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful that the Honourable Lady for a Change acknowledged the support that the government is providing to families up and down the country. Particular attention was given in designing those schemes to how to get the support to prepayment meters. The ministers are always engaged with stakeholders to make sure that there is awareness of those schemes, and I'll make sure that we keep up those efforts so that people do get the help that they need and deserve.
David Morris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's very interesting that the Leader of the Opposition says about keeping council tax low when the Labour Party voted to increase Morecambe Town Council from historically £400,000, £200,000 to £2 million. So, on that basis, I'd like to meet with the Prime Minister to see where we can find government time to cap parish councils from doing this sort of abhorrent behaviour.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight that council tax in Labour areas is higher than that in Conservative areas, which is not right at a time when there are pressures on the cost of living. I look forward to meeting him to discuss his plans to keep British families' household bills as low as they can be.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dozens of Sudanese doctors who'd been working in the NHS were stranded and not allowed to return here. Last week, the Minister told us here that the Prime Minister took the decision to get them back. So why hadn't such a straightforward decision been